let's talk about conversations that focus on Africa's debt vulnerability. Restructuring and sustainability were not in short supply at the week-long World Bank IMF spring meetings that ended on Sunday. If you add high inflation to rising interest rate to the mix, then you were talking about a cocktail of headwinds for commodities and non-commodities dependent African economies. My guest on this is Agnes Gitau. She is the managing partner at GBS Africa, an advisory services firm based in London. She's also the executive director in charge of UK and Europe at the Eastern African Association. Good evening, Agnes. It's good to see you connecting to us on the show tonight.
Good evening, Gordon. Thank you for having me.
I'm sure you guys spent some time last week listening to these conversations in Washington, in particular around Africa, because your GBS Africa is about Africa's advisory, so you've got a whole lot of things doing across Africa. But give me your takeaways as far as debt's concerned for Africa, restructuring, sustainability. What are your takeaways from those panels that you listened to very closely?
Thank you very much, Boston. Yes, the whole of last week conversation during the IMF and World Bank spring meetings have just focused on debt and Africa's debt situation, with many countries, at least over 40 countries, at a risk of debt distress. And already 2 countries, Ghana and Zambia, have defaulted on their sovereign debt, and many more are likely to be in the same category if immediate actions are not taken. So a couple of things that came out from the conversation is, how can you reshape development at the same time address Africa's debt problem, while at the same time ensuring that you focus on investment and also focus on key sectors like healthcare, education, and infrastructure. Secondly, how can government and policymakers be innovative and creative in coming up with structures and reforms that are able to address the current debt situation, and what solutions are out there, and also conversation around the role of IMF and World Bank, and this is and some of the resources and technical capacity they can support developing countries, particularly in Africa.
What policies do you think African sovereigns can develop to prevent debt vulnerabilities?
Just don't borrow, Boston. Just live within your means. And when you borrow, make sure you have something to show as to what that funds go to. We have spent the last decade borrowing funds to develop our economies. Africa's development has really focused on public borrowing. How can we move that and ensure that there is private sector participation when it comes to Africa's growth? And finally, how do you become prudent? How can governments be prudent and innovative and exploring opportunities where they can grow their economies without really depending on someone else's money? Now we're speaking about restructuring, and a famous economist said, debt restructuring is almost like a surgery. You don't do it if you don't have to do it if you can do without it, right? And it can be right, or it can go completely wrong. Because a lot of people, particularly international investors, are wary when governments start asking for conditions or better conditions to pay back, or start asking for structures on how to pay back their funds. Of course, your credit status is threatened, and you're not able to borrow or participate in the international market.
Well, we've got debt sustainability on one hand, but we've got high interest rates and runaway inflation in a number of African countries. So what else can central banks do here? Do you think central banks can really do anything? Do you think they've got their hands on inflation, interest rate? And if there's anything they can contribute, I'm sure conversations around that was also up at this summit.
To the credit of our central bank across the African continent, I think they've been very, very effective in the way they've managed the situation, which is beyond the continent, right? Global economies are experiencing the same challenges as we are in the continent, right? But all their tools, you raise interest rates to address inflation, high rates of inflation. But how can that be manageable when inflation in the continent, still in most of our countries where we're net importers, where inflation is imported, right? The impact of Ukraine and Russia war, the impact of high rates in the developed economies, of course, has an impact on local economies in the continent. How can we be creative addressing issues, and also the traditional solution that when you address inflation by raising interest rates? Is that something that we need to look and find alternative ways of managing or having monetary policies that work for the continent, not responding as to what everyone else is doing?
Well, I'm sure you saw those forecasts, reviewed economic forecasts for growth forecasts for sub-Saharan Africa, for whether they are commodity dependent like Nigeria, Ghana, Angola. South Africa got a very soggy prospects for non-African, non-commodity country economies such as Kenya and a few others. Again, you look at the fact that with all the problems, foreign investment inflows to the continent is beginning to dry up, and that's what the latest Sub-Saharan Africa report released by the IMF Africa Department showed. So what do you make of all of this? Where do we see growth happening?
Well, from the same story, commodity-dependent economies like you guys in Nigeria, you've talked about it's a continuous conversation around diversifying your economy so that you don't necessarily depend on oil and other resources. Just last week, OPEC countries have talked about oil prices being reduced. What impact does that have on countries like Nigeria, Angola, and the rest? We've seen service sector-led economies like Kenya, Ethiopia, and Rwanda, and Cote d'Ivoire going to lead Africa's growth, growing by over 5%. Unfortunately, big economies like South Africa, with its challenges, with energy challenges, their growth is predicted to be about 0.1%. Nigeria also following a very a year of campaigning and politicking, of course, and also the other challenges of inflation and high volatile currency, of course, has had an impact on Nigeria's growth. But look, GDP and economic focus across the globe is just going to be, it's all gloomy. But we need to find solutions that work and that can try and reassure international investors, because that's the only way we can rebuild. You're aware that foreign aid, overseas assistance has dried up in the past decade, and because big economies are focusing on their demands in their countries, and therefore have no way or window of supporting developing economies. So we have to find solutions at home. And for me, this is making sure that our economies are stable, we have credible business, conducive environment for doing business, ensuring that we have policies that attract investment. One thing I talked about is currency risk. How do you ensure that our currency is stable? Sometimes you have no control because, of course, most of our economies are pegged against the USD. But how do we ensure that we address issues like exit risk, project risk, some of the stuff that investors will be looking at, but more importantly, how in the midst of gloomy economic outlook, how do we start reassuring international investment flows back to the continent? And it's just building structures at home that can be able to attract or have a foundation to attract investment.
Interesting. I'm sure, Agnes, I'm sure yourself and a lot of your folks out there will be having a lot to discuss with this growth forecast, with those who want to invest in Africa, those who want to do businesses, do direct investment, what we'll be telling them and all of that. I'm sure it's a conversation that will be the fallout of the just concluded World Bank IMF Summit spring meetings for 2023 in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much, business leader and executive director at Eastern Africa Association for the UK and Europe, Agnes Gitau, the managing partner also at GBS Africa.